So the question was a beer with a deceased scientist, and you also give the opportunity to get them up to speed on where insect population stands, or the newest surveillance technologies, where the field stands. Who would that be, and what would you talk about?
There's two spring to mind. Can I have two?
Yeah, two. Take five.
The first one was probably chosen by half your other guests, which would be Darwin, which is a bit predictable, but for the very good reason that he really loved bumblebees. He discovered loads of things about bumblebees for the first time. Including one of his more famous things was he studied the way male bumblebees do this weird kind of patrolling to attract mates. They mark out a kind of route, and then a whole gang of them race round and round and round it in circles all day long. And he got his kids to sort of stand at different points on the route and shout when they saw the bee going past. They sprinkled flour. They used little sugar shakers and sprinkled flour onto the bees so they looked like kind of ghost bees, so they were easier to see, and all sorts of crazy stuff. He'd probably be horrified by the state of the insects today, sadly, because obviously things were, you read accounts. Well, so the other person I'd choose lived really close to Darwin, but a little bit later, there's a guy called William Sladen, who no one's ever heard of, but he was kind of the first person to study bumblebees, and he wrote a book, the first ever book about bumblebees, called The Humble Bee. Because interestingly, bumblebees used to be called humblebees, and then they became bumblebees about 100 years ago. Nobody really knows why, but anyway, that's another.
I didn't know that.
Another story. But he talks about, he describes as familiar garden insects, species which are extremely rare or extinct today. And it would be really nice to pick his brains about, obviously I'm a bit of a bumblebee fanatic. That's my main core research interest. And to be able to talk to someone who knew these really rare species when they were common would be pretty amazing. He found the nests and he reared them in his shed. And even when he was he started this when he was a kid. He was kind of a child prodigy. He wrote a little book about bumblebees when he was 16. At a time when nobody knew anything about them at all. He just, kind of acquired this knowledge somehow. Anyway, I'd go for those. So they both lived in Kent in the southeast of England, oddly enough. But,
a hot spot.
What do you think they'd be saying today about the state of insects? I mean, how surprised would they be? I guess they would be surprised, but how surprised would they be about the declines that we're seeing now?
Well, I guess it's interesting because conservation just wasn't an issue in their day.
Right.
Sladen was around in the early 20th century, and really it hadn't occurred to people to really worry, I don't think at that stage in history, to worry that species might disappear, or that there was any problem with us over exploiting the planet. So it would be a complete news to them. It's not something I don't think they would have predicted or expected. And obviously, I guess they'd be rather depressed. It would be a strange thing if they could see us today, and they would immediately see how profoundly different the landscape is now to what it was 100 years ago. And that's something that we can't easily appreciate because we've just grown up with the landscape we have around us. And although it has been changing during our lifetime, because it's a slow process.
Creeping expectations by people and by society about what constitutes normal, right?
Shifting baselines. And I came across it was an interesting paper I saw the other day where they show these aerial photographs of a bit of French countryside. And the first was taken in 1950, and then it was 4 of them about 15, 20 years apart up to the present day. And it was just amazing how today, big fields, not quite as big as you have in parts of North America, but 50-hectare fields or whatever. In 1958, when the first photograph was taken, the landscape was composed of hundreds of tiny little fields, like this kind of colourful patchwork of little fields, and it's all just been swept away in a single human's lifetime. But nobody really notices it. I find that kind of fascinating. Slightly worrying.
Super interesting. Well, Dave, it's just fantastic to get you on the show. We've been talking about insect declines for some time and wanting to get you on the show to talk about this. So I'm glad we finally get a chance. And I want to just jump right in with both feet and ask how bad is it? You've focused particularly on bees around the world, and you've documented declines in several groups, including bumblebees. But let's just start with bees. How bad is it?
Yeah, so bad. I mean, I think there's no doubt at all that wild bees, but not honeybees, and it's important to make that distinction. Wild bees have declined a lot. Not every species, some are clearly much tougher than others for reasons we don't fully understand. And I have to kind of throw in the caveat that actually the majority of bee species are not really monitored. But the ones that we are monitoring, or which we have some kind of data for, predominantly show declines. We've got better data for bumblebees than anything else. We've got better data for Europe and North America than for any other region. But certainly the most obvious sign of decline is we've seen these really massive range contractions in quite a few species. So, you know, in the UK, we've lost 2 species in the 20th century, and quite a few others that used to be common bees. I mentioned how, you know, Sladen used to see these things in his garden, and now to find one, you've got to drive hundreds of miles. You've got to go to one of the last kind of little populations that's clinging on in a nature reserve somewhere. One species has gone extinct. A bumblebee has gone extinct in North America, Franklin's bumblebee. So that's obviously the sort of end point of range contractions. And thankfully, most haven't got there yet, but there are quite a few heading that way. The rusty patch bumblebee, another North American species, has also undergone these really spectacular range contractions. And that used to be a very common insect across the whole of the eastern side of North America, and now you know it's down to a handful of individuals almost.
So do the range contractions follow any particular pattern? Are they, you know, contracting northward? Are they contracting southward? Or is it sort of idiosyncratic based on whatever land use changes, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think it's mainly just driven by habitat loss. So species seem to contract generally towards the core of their range. So that both the north and the southern edges seem to disappear. And that kind of makes sense, that if something's in an area that's marginal for it in terms of climate, and then the habitat deteriorates, it's going to disappear there before somewhere where the climate is kind of perfect for it, all else being equal, sense. I guess. But superimposed on that, there's a really interesting phenomenon that so there've been some studies looking at the effects of climate change on bumblebees in particular, which have shown that the southern edges of the ranges have shifted northwards in the last 50 years, but the northern edges haven't shifted northwards, which is slightly puzzling. You know, obviously, all else being equal, you'd expect the range to just shift wholesale, but it seems like they're not able to colonize northwards, even though the temperature must presumably now be suitable.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think of these older studies by Camille Parmesan and colleagues, right? And haven't they shown primarily that it's the northern edges of these species ranges that are moving more than the southern edges for sort of, you know, insect taxa more generally?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly there are species that are moving northwards, and obviously you'd kind of expect in places like Britain, where weather's pretty miserable most of the time. Lots of insects are at the northern edge of their range here. So actually, you might well predict that in terms of numbers of species, we might benefit from climate change as continental species move northwards and invade. And certainly some have. The Parmesan work that I know is mostly on butterflies, and there are a few examples of butterflies that have moved north. But bumblebees, for some reason, don't seem to be following that pattern of moving northwards at all. So it was described in the first paper that was published on this as a climate vice, that they're kind of being squashed from the bottom, these being primarily northern hemisphere creatures. But the top, isn't going anywhere, so their range is just being slowly squashed. My guess is it's just lack of habitat. They would move northwards if, as climates have changed and ice ages have come and gone in the past, they've presumably shifted slowly backwards and forwards. Mm-hmm. But the habitat is now so fragmented that it's much harder for anything to shift like that. Yeah. I'm just guessing though.
Dave, can we circle back to something you said a minute ago to try to get, be as explicit as possible about the scope of the problem? How many bees are there in the world? How many species of bees are there? And then, I want to hear the answer to that question en route to who is it that we're monitoring, and what fraction of total bees are we attending to in any detail?
So there are 20,000 species of bee in the world, and the sad truth is we haven't got a clue what's happening with most of them. There is no long-term monitoring scheme in place and this is actually, you could have made the same statements about insects generally. There are 1.1-ish million named species of insect, and for the very large majority, we haven't got any data at all on any measure of their population change or range change or anything else really.
Somebody just described them at some point, and that's it.
Yeah, exactly.
They have a name.
You've got a type specimen in a museum somewhere. We know where it was caught, and there may be a few other sporadic records. That's it. So it's pretty kind of worrying in a sense and of course we also know that there are lots of species we haven't even described. So obviously we don't know what's happening with them because we haven't even got to the point of having
what they are. Yeah.
So how many do you estimate that there are altogether?
No, don't ask me to. Okay. And that's not my area, but I mean, other people have tried to extrapolate how many insects there might be in the world, and the most conservative estimates suggest maybe 2 or 3 million, and the top end is maybe 10 million. But there's a pretty big confidence intervals. We don't know.
Fair enough.
And it's not my job to try. That's not my area of speciality at all. But suffice to say, there's an awful lot, and for most of them, we haven't got a clue. I mean, so and also the geographic the geographic distribution of our knowledge about insects is extremely biased and patchy. So basically, we know quite a lot about European and North American insects. Relatively speaking, and almost nothing at all for all of the presumably extraordinary diversity of insects living in South America, Africa, and Asia, and pretty much Australia too, but just no long-term monitoring of any species. So, it's very hard to make any sensible, accurate, reliable statements about what's happening to insects globally, given that the place where the most insects live, we just
no idea.
Don't know.
Yeah.
You can guess, I mean, you've only got to see an aerial photograph of oil palm plantations stretching across Indonesia where it used to be rainforest to think, well, seems pretty likely there are fewer insects there now than there used to be, but nobody's counting, sadly.
Why don't we know those things? Is it, anytime insects come up, to especially non-biologists, they're too icky and too gross and creepy crawly. I mean, is it sort of the lack of charisma for most of them, say to birds, the passion that so many people have to go and twitch and count their birds, or is it just the difficulty and the cost of doing it accurately, or some combination?
I think it's all of those things. I mean, there are so many of them that it's really difficult to set up a monitoring scheme for. So people, what you can do is you can set up a monitoring scheme for one of the more easily identified groups, which and it has to be a group that doesn't have too many species. But the classic is, of course, butterflies. We do a lot of monitoring of butterflies in North America and Europe because they're big, they're colourful. People kind of like them. they're relatively easy to identify. And so it's possible to get, you know, citizen scientists out there walking transects, counting butterflies. And you can just about do that with bumblebees. We've got a scheme running now in the UK for bumblebees. And maybe if you're really lucky, you might do it on a limited scale with one or two other insect groups, dragonflies maybe, or hoverflies possibly at a push. But then, you know, you're still only really scratching the surface of you know, insect abundance. There are so few people that can identify most in, you know, you look at, say, parasitoid wasps, which is, you know, an enormously diverse group. There's only a handful of people in the world that can identify them. And then you've got to kill them and get them under a microscope and, you know, count the hairs on their hind leg or whatever it might be. So it's just not really, the logistics of monitoring insects in any kind of detailed way are really daunting. Plus, of course, you know, they just don't have the number of people interested in them that perhaps bigger, more charismatic creatures do.
Well, I think we want to come back around in the end to your ideas for how we might monitor these things better in a long-term way. But let's maybe save that for just a little bit later. Maybe tell us just about your interest in bees. So how did you get so interested in bees and come to monitor their declines?
I mean, I started out, I always loved insects. I don't know, you know, actually, can I just stop? My dog is barking.
Of course.
I don't know whether the phone is picking her up, but I
hear occasional bark, but you know, it adds color, right?
It's fine.
Go let her in.
Yeah. Is that a decent redirect to bees?
Yeah, I think we're hitting a lot of cool stuff, but you know, we want to make sure that we get to most everything. So I pushed through some of that stuff. He seemed to frame the conservation on bees, and so we can stick with
it. Outside, and it's getting a bit cold and dark out there for her.
Yeah. My dog would be doing the same.
It just started to snow.
Sorry,
here.
How did I get interested in? Yeah, so I'll recap. I like many people. I had a kind of bug phase when I was a kid. You know, I collected caterpillars and reared them up and that kind of thing. And you know, I remember I read somewhere that E.O. Wilson said that, you know, he never grew out of his bug phase, and I didn't either. And I think, you know, that's a lot of people who end up studying insects are the same. It was just a kind of, you know, so I just find them really fascinating from an early age. But I was more focused on butterflies, really. Well, I guess, you know, because they're pretty, and like most people, I was kind of drawn to them initially. And it wasn't until I was, I guess I was in my late 20s, it was the best part of 30 years ago now, that I started studying bumblebees and bees more generally. And it was just one of those things. I was, I got a faculty position at Southampton University, which, you know, was great. And suddenly, rather than being a postdoc who was told what to do, I had to kind of develop my own research program, which was kind of exciting, but also terrifying because I didn't really know what I was doing. And I wrote a couple of grant applications for funding to study butterfly ecology and conservation kind of areas, and they didn't get any funding. And anyway, one day I was sitting in a nature reserve, it's kind of idly watching some bees, bumblebees as it turned out. And I noticed this odd thing, which is that they, and you can see this in any patch of flowers. If you just watch bees, and obviously not so much in December, but in the summer. If you watch a bee, she'll fly from flower to flower, but she'll often come up to a flower and turn away, veer off at the last minute without touching it. And I saw that, and I thought, you know, what's wrong with that flower? Why didn't she land on it? You know. And they do it all the time. It's really obvious. Once you know to look for it, you see it everywhere. And I looked in there, I kind of did a bit of quick kind of literature search, and I couldn't find an explanation. So I started kind of looking into it, and I had a couple of project students and eventually a PhD student, a girl called Jane Stout. And we spent about 5 years studying this. To cut a long story short, basically they're sniffing the flower for the faint kind of smelly footprint of a previous bee visitor. So every time a bee lands on a flower, she accidentally leaves some oily hydrocarbons on the petal. just the hydrocarbons they naturally have all over their body.
Mm-hmm.
And then other bees use that as a cue that the flower is likely to be empty. If it smells of a recent bee visit, there's no point in landing because there won't be any nectar.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Anyway, I thought that was kind of cool, and by the time I'd finished studying that, I was sort of hooked on them. And I mean, I guess the thing that struck me was that they were just so much more interesting than butterflies. You know, butterflies are beautiful, but they're pretty kind of simple creatures, really. You know, they're not terribly intelligent. Their behaviours are, relatively speaking, kind of fairly boring.
Yep.
And whereas bees are just fascinating. You know, they do so much weird stuff.
I've studied a number of Lepidoptera, and I think I'm with you on that. With the exception of hawk moths, which I think are kind of in between in niche space, right? I mean, they're vastly more interesting than your typical Lepidoptera. So.
Yeah, go along with that.
Yeah, and you could, well, we had Lars Chitka on earlier in the season, and he blew me away with the amazing things that bees can do. That was
yeah, he's famous. He persuades bees to do things that nobody else has, you know.
Yeah, probably people would do things they wouldn't otherwise do.
Yeah. Well, probably, yeah. Playing football and God knows what else. I don't know what he'll come up with next. Recognizing faces, yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we do need to turn to sort of the negative side of the conversation and start to touch some of the factors that are driving bee declines. And there's a big list of them, so we probably don't have time today, and maybe we'll come too depressed to make it through the conversation. But could we start with habitat loss? I think that's one of the more prominent ones. So what sorts of habitat, losing those sorts of habitat, is most negative for bee populations?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, bees need flowers primarily, and somewhere to nest. And I think most people would agree that probably the availability of flowers is the one that's more commonly limiting of those two things. And just the modern landscape tends to have rather few flowers in. If you look at a farmed landscape compared to what it used to, or compared to kind of natural or semi-natural habitats. And certainly in a European context, it's slightly different in North America, but in Europe, we used to have huge tracts of species-rich grasslands, particularly hay meadows, and also chalk downland, which are, well, usually these days regarded as sort of a man-made habitat, a semi-natural habitat created by grazing and by hay cutting, practices that went on for hundreds or thousands of years. But they maintained this really species-rich habitat with lots of really high densities and diversity of flowers. And they're fantastic places for insects of all types. So just in the UK, which is a pretty small country, we used to have about 7 million hectares of species-rich grassland up to about 1920. And then in the next 70 years, we destroyed 97% of that habitat, which, you know, and replaced it with either with arable crops, which tend, you know, either to have no flowers unless they happen to be a flowering crop, and then there's just a glut of flowers for 2 weeks and then it's gone again. Mm-hmm. Or the other habitat, which is kind of often replaced these species-rich grasslands, is improved pasture, as it's known in farming terms, which is usually just a ryegrass monoculture of, you know, bright green pasture, good if you're trying to feed cows. Well,
for
actually,
cow,
that's debatable.
Yeah,
exactly. Mm-hmm. So certainly, you know, looking at Britain, most of the species of bee that have declined used to be found in these flower-rich grassland areas. Actually, there's an interesting little, just as an aside, you know, people, as I say, regard these grasslands as man-made, and we used to wonder, you know, what did all the flowers and bees and butterflies do before people made all this amazing habitat for them? But of course, actually now there's been a kind of a shift in perception of this, and it's most people accept that actually probably there were lots of grasslands maintained by large herbivores before people came along. and this idea that Europe used to be a kind of dense forest pre-humans was actually probably incorrect. And there were elephants and all sorts of huge things knocking over trees and keeping open areas, and that's where bees and butterflies used to live. And then we just replaced that with livestock and sort of maintained those habitats until the 20th century, when we swept them all away.
So are these insect declines motivating anybody to try to get back to more diverse, grasslands and supportive agriculture? So sort of dial back the clock somehow in terms of species diversity?
Yeah, there are interesting things happening. For a long time now, there have been moves to, there are subsidies available to farmers in Europe, for example, to put in flower strips, to reduce cutting of hedgerows. And they can also get subsidies to actually replant or recreate from scratch flower-rich grasslands. But you don't see that much of it. Many farmers haven't really engaged with it. The funding isn't really adequate. It's not really been a game changer, because certainly so in the UK, we started funding these agri-environment schemes 25 years ago at least. And yet all the evidence we have is that insects are still declining, sadly.
Right. Well, still probably in most people's economic interest to not bother with that stuff, right?
Some of the schemes are fairly well funded. There's some of them that pay about £500 a hectare for the top end every year. So that's the kind of restoring a species-rich grassland. But the problem is or one of the problems I think, is that it's very unfamiliar territory to farmers. They've become used to growing crops. They know how to grow crops. They don't know how to restore a species-rich grassland, and they don't know what it should look like. They can't. They've been gone too long for the farmers. It was their grandparents that remembered what they looked like.
Shifting baselines for them too, right?
And they don't have the equipment.
And there's probably a social effect also of, if you have too many weeds growing on the side of your field, right, then it doesn't look right.
Well, yeah, absolutely. There is a sort of farmer tidiness, just as there is with gardens. Actually, there's a whole interesting world of conversation to be had there. But so far, although there's governments have created national pollinator strategies, and there's all this talk about what we might do to kind of in the way of nature-friendly farming and this kind of thing, but the reality is it hasn't delivered much yet. I think we need a real kind of step change in how much of that kind of thing we're doing if we're really going to make any difference. It feels a bit like a drop in the ocean at the moment.
So in terms of habitat loss, it's habitat change. It's lost in the sense that the species we're trying to conserve no longer have what they would prefer or need. But do we know anything about urbanization effects? For certain bee species in particular, I'm interested to know if there's a bee equivalent of a cockroach or, the black rat or something like that. Are there species that are thriving, and are they thriving because of urbanization?
Not quite a direct analogies to rats, perhaps, but
you won't
there
go
are.
Not that far.
So there are certainly. So we did some work 15 years ago now. Two things we did. One was we got young bumblebee nests and we put them in different habitats to see how they did. And one of those habitats was urban areas. And then we had we had farms, conventional farms and farms with extra flowers and this kind of thing. And the ones that did best of all were the ones in the gardens, much better than even the farms with extra flowers were nowhere near as good as the gardens. And we've also done stuff looking at using genetic markers to fingerprint bee workers and then count how many sisterhoods there were in different areas as a measure of how many wild colonies there are. Obviously all the workers from a colony being sisters. Actually, that's a bit more complicated than that, but in bumblebees, they generally are anyway. Okay. And again, the estimates of nest densities are much higher in urban areas, sometimes quite extraordinarily high. So certainly, but only for common species. So there seem to be a few species of bumblebee that are really adaptable. And, this is the same with most groups, birds,
right,
other groups of insects, whatever. There seem to be a few really robust species that can cope with whatever we throw at them, and then lots of others that quickly expire. They can't cope at all. But the adaptable ones seem to have adopted gardens as pretty good habitat. And obviously they do tend to have quite high densities of flowers. It's very patchy from one garden to the next. But if you're a bee and you can happily fly over a few fences, there's always a garden somewhere in an urban area with flowers. So compared to farmland, urban areas are not bad for adaptable species that can cope with, the sort of challenges of urban areas. I mean, there must be lots of pollution. There's, probably traffic collisions to cope with.
Other downsides, but there are some gardens.
In these urban areas, how important do you think light pollution is? And I ask because we talked to Kevin Gaston just a couple of weeks ago and had a great conversation about light pollution. So how much does that affect urban bees?
Yeah, well, for bees, I'm not convinced it's a big deal. I mean, I've read some really interesting papers in recent years suggesting that it's obviously impacts other insects, particularly nocturnal insects, and probably has some interesting, or could have interesting effects, messing up the phenology of insects because they can't, they're incorrectly assessing the day length because of the artificial lights. But so far as I know, there's no evidence for that. And bees, obviously bees tend to be only active in the day, which probably reduces their kind of susceptibility to light pollution. And I'm not aware of any evidence that lights have messed up the phenology of bee flight patterns or anything like that. So I'm guessing that light pollution is more of an issue for many other insects than it is for bees.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let's turn to a different cause of declines. I want to talk about parasites and diseases just for a few minutes. And this is particularly interesting to me in the context of honeybees interacting with wild bees and thinking about diseases going both ways. And I think, in the news media, you hear a lot about honeybee diseases, and they've accumulated lots of bad things over the last few decades. But just sort of give us a state of disease ecology among bees generally and how important those routes are back and forth.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area, and there's been a lot of published research in recent years, but still we're just scratching the surface really, because we know so little about the diseases of wild insects. Almost all bee disease research until the last 10 or 15 years was on honeybees. And in fact, almost all insect disease research was on honeybees. And we know honeybees suffer from quite a range of parasites and pathogens, viruses and fungi and bacteria and all sorts, some of which are specific to honeybees, but many of them seem to be generalist bee diseases or sometimes insect diseases. So, for example, deformed wing virus, which is very common in honeybees, will happily infect wild bees. And there are records of it turning up in non-bees, wasps, and even, if I recall correctly, hoverflies. So these are just kind of insect diseases. We think of them as honeybee diseases just because that's where they were discovered, but actually honeybee may not be the main host at all sometimes.
And are they more widespread given people moving honeybee colonies around the landscape for pollination services? So is that spreading this all over the place? Yeah,
so that's the problem. Of course, these diseases are kind of natural on the whole, and things like the varroa mite. It's as much right to live on this planet as we have, as far as I'm concerned. But the trouble is, we've messed things up by shifting them around, and people started moving honeybees around the world hundreds of years ago, before we even knew there was such a thing as a bacteria or a virus. So obviously they didn't check those colonies to make sure they were clean. And this has continued even up to the present day, that we're still pretty lax with bee hygiene. So honeybees get moved all over the world, and we've accidentally spread a whole range of their diseases with them, and sometimes with serious consequences. So, for example, there's a thing called Nosema cerani, which is It's a microsporidian parasite that originated in the Asian honeybee. It's a different species of honeybee naturally found in Asia. But it's spread around the world, probably with honeybees that were taken to Asia and then became infected and then have been shipped elsewhere. We're not entirely sure. But that will happily jump from honeybees into bumblebees. And it's been detected at fairly high frequency in wild bumblebees in Europe. We don't know exactly when it got here. We don't really have much clue how many bees it's killing, but in the lab, it can be fatal. So it's kind of concerning that this, Asian gut parasite is somehow got itself from Asian honeybees in China to British bumblebees flying around here, And the varroa mite gets the kind of most attention it's the most famous of the sort of bee parasites, I guess. But that thankfully only affects honeybees. It hasn't yet jumped into
and just for our listeners, this is a mite that gets into the tracheal systems of the bees, right, and sort of clogs up the air tubes that supply oxygen and facilitate gas exchange, right?
Well, no, actually, I think you're thinking of tracheal mites.
Oh, okay, that's not the varroa mite.
Yeah, no,
okay.
The varroa mite is external to the bee. They're quite big. They're kind of shield side. They look like a little brown shield stuck to the side of the bee.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm totally thinking of tracheal mites because my postdoctoral advisor John Harrison worked on those for some years, and yeah. So
well,
they'd be appalled that I confuse those.
They're pretty horrible too. But the varroa mite is the big impact of the varroa mite is it's a vector of viruses. And so as it feeds on the hemolymph of the bees, it spreads disease. And honeybee colonies that are badly infested with varroa usually die, but they die from viral infections primarily that are just being transmitted so effectively by the parasite.
So Dave,
thankfully,
I'm sorry, go ahead. I interrupted.
No, sorry. I'm not letting you get a question in.
No. There's so many questions. We'll keep you on for 3 hours if you like. The colony collapse disorder phenomenon, is that caused by this deformed wing virus, or is it a slew of viruses? Are we still unsure?
I think we're still unsure.
Okay.
But partly the complication comes from the fact that people are vary in what they mean by colony collapse disorder. Some people are very precise, and it's colonies dying from a particular symptoms with the seemingly the workers abandoning the brood and just sort of disappearing. It used to be called Marie Celeste syndrome, and but it's become more generally used as to describe any colony death, and I think it's probably. We've had these sort of big outbreaks, perhaps the wrong word, but these incidents where lots of colonies have died, particularly in North America, but it's happened in Europe and elsewhere. And each time, I suspect it's not precisely the same combination of factors at play. And I think probably the best understanding we have is it's usually a combination of events that's stressed the bees excessively through perhaps exposure to pesticides, depressing the immune system, which then enables viruses to infect them more effectively and do more damage, or there are various combinations of stressors that are much more potent together than they are in isolation. But it's complicated, and I would if there was a single cause of colony collapse disorder, we'd know what it was by now. Clearly, there's more to it than that.
So in terms of mechanisms for cutting down on the spread of diseases, it seems like the obvious thing is to not move bees around nearly as much. So are there programs to try to cut down on these movements? Do you favor much stricter restrictions on where people can take their colonies?
So one thing we haven't mentioned actually is it's got to be in there because it's a really interesting new-ish angle on this, is that we've also started commercially rearing and shipping bumblebees around the world, which has exacerbated the problems we'd already created by shipping honeybees around the world.
And that's because they're better pollinators for some things?
They're really good at pollinating tomatoes is the big product, because that needs buzz pollinating, and honeybees are useless at buzz pollinating, so they don't even visit tomato flowers. Other Solanaceae also, and there's other plants too, but tomatoes is the big one. So it's usually for glasshouse use. But the bumblebees, someone in the Netherlands, actually a guy who was a vet, strangely, but he worked out how to breed bumblebees in the late 80s and set up a little factory selling them, and it quickly became a global business with huge factories churning out literally millions of bumblebee nests and shipping them around the world. But the bumblebees are reared on pollen collected by honeybee keepers who make money by sticking pollen traps on their honeybee hives and then supplying the pollen to the bumblebee factories. So you've got this horribly efficient mechanism for taking honeybee diseases and giving them to bumblebees and then shipping bumblebees all over the world. And there's really no regulation of that trade at all. So we know that, you know, they're shipped from Europe they've been taken to the Americas.
Is there any prospect for regulation, or is it just no way, it's not going to happen? It doesn't seem likely. It really needs international agreement. You know, so the US, for example, and Canada no longer allow importation of non-native bees. So you can't buy a European bumblebee and nest and take it to the States anymore. But the factories will sell them to anyone that'll buy them, as far as I can tell. They don't seem to have any scruples whatsoever. So we know, for example, they sold European bumblebees to Chile in 1998, and now there's an invasion of South America by European bumblebees carrying European bee diseases, which have had a really disastrous effect on. There's a beautiful. The only bumblebee native to the bottom half of South America is the world's biggest bumblebee, Bombus dalbomii. Giant ginger thing. It looks like a flying mouse, I'm told. I've never had the pleasure of seeing them. And it used to be really common in Chile and Argentina, but it's teetering on the edge of extinction because it's been wiped out seemingly by the diseases being carried by these European bumblebees. So it's really tragic and you know, entirely predictable. I mean, you know, 1998 wasn't that long ago. We surely knew better than to just introduce a new species to a new continent without even thinking to check its health. It's just ridiculous. And it could happen again tomorrow, you know, because there's no law preventing it, basically.
Yeah. You know, Dave, a minute ago, you raised a really interesting point, and maybe to turn to the pesticide issue, that the effects of these diseases may be exacerbated when the parasites and viruses, whatever it might be, are showing up in contexts where things like neonicotinoids are also being used. How much do we worry about? What do we know about pesticides in bumblebees and honeybees?
Yeah, I mean, there's really clear evidence. It's funny. I mean, this is hugely controversial. It's the one area of kind of bee science where there's massive controversy. Because of course there's a lot of money at stake. For me, I think it's completely clear and obvious that current pesticide use is contributing to bee declines. I think it's an overwhelming body of evidence. Some pesticides are worse than others, neonicotinoids undoubtedly among the more harmful ones, but we shouldn't get completely focused on neonicotinoids. You know, there are 500 different pesticides used in Europe, and I think nearly twice that many used in North America.
Not surprising.
And you know, many of them are probably harmful to bees, depending on the circumstances. But you know, the problem is, of course, there's a strong vested interest in disputing this, and there are, you know, industry itself. But it's very similar to what happened with tobacco in the 20th century. I think it's the best way I can explain it.
Confuse and deny.
Exactly, kind of smoke and mirrors, publish counter claims, you know, get your own scientists to dispute every piece of evidence that suggests pesticides do harm bees, to produce counter evidence, to make it seem like there's a controversy when actually there isn't really a controversy, which makes it really easy for politicians to avoid doing anything, because they can say, oh, well, you know, we need a bit more research, you know, the scientists can't agree. Yeah, so it's frustrating. And it's really, I mean, it's also really interesting to see how it plays out, you know, that that different parts of the world can look at the same body of evidence and come to quite different conclusions, seemingly. You know, the European Union put a lot of, had a team of scientists basically investigate neonicotinoids, and they spent about a year doing it and wrote this enormous report, which basically concluded that neonicotinoids pose an unacceptable risk to bees, was how they put it. And so the European Union banned them, or banned most of them. But, you know, the rest of the world disagrees, seemingly. You know, in the United States, they're still obviously widely used, and no signs at all of any serious restrictions on their use.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, you guys can see the same academic studies that we can see. So it's kind of interesting that, you know, different conclusions are drawn.
Yeah.
But
Well, different vested interests too, right?
Yeah, the pressure that comes from the people that are manufacturing these things is going to be different through different mechanisms. I've dipped my toe into the pesticide research world with some work that I did on atrazine in the past, and that's just a different universe to the rest of the science that we do. That's,
yeah.
Yeah.
No, it was a real eye opener for me. You know, it's interesting. I mean, so the way I got involved was back in 2006. I set up this charity, the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, which I'm sure you've never heard of, but it's a charity to save bumblebees, as the you know, as the name suggests. And that was sort of when the neonicotinoid kind of controversy was starting to get sort of build momentum, and it's a membership-based charity, and a lot of the members were contacting us saying, you know, what are you doing about these neonicotinoids? They're killing the bees. And at the time, I'd never worked on pesticides, and I was a bit skeptical. So we thought we'd do a bit of work on this. We did a fairly simple experiment with bumblebee nests, and we dosed some with neonicotinoids and left some without, and it had a big impact, and it got in Science, you know, much to our delight. And we published it in 2012, and boy, you know, I had no idea what that world was like, and suddenly we were just embroiled in this bloodbath of, you know, recrimination and abuse and criticism, and, you know, people suddenly emerging online, writing these articles about us, saying that we were, you know, scientists for hire, that we were making up our results, and all sorts of stuff. And I thought, oh my God, what have I got into?
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. Welcome to
Terrifying.
the boxing ring, right?
Yeah.
Hey, Dave, this is our producer, Matt Blois, who just joined.
Hi, Matt.
Hey, Dave.
I want to stick on pesticides just for another minute and ask, I was really amazed by something you said in this 2015 Science Express paper of yours about just the total number of pesticides that have been detected in honey and in honeybee colonies. It was like, you know, more than 100, I think. And that raises this issue of, you know, people do studies, but they often do studies on single compounds, right? But the bees often are exposed to cocktails of these things that may have interactive effects. Is there anybody who's grappling with this interactive effect problem?
We've tried, and I'm sure there are others trying. It's just one of those things that's really intractable experimentally, you know, because there are so many combinations of chemicals.
Yeah, your experiment blows up to, you know, some giant hypervolume. Right? I mean,
you can just about cope with two, but you know, as you say, the reality is you look in the honey or pollen in a bee nest, and you know, commonly find 10, 15, 20 different pesticides.
Yeah.
And you know, where do you, and every nest has a different combination depending on where it's been, you know, where they've been foraging. So it's a nightmare. And we also, you know, the regulatory process is fundamentally flawed for this same reason, because it studies one compound at a time. You know, if you bring a new compound and you want to get it licensed to sell to farmers, yeah, you have to show that particular product doesn't kill a honeybee in a lab test. But you obviously don't expose it. You know, that's a really healthy honeybee.
What about that one with the other 100 pesticides that they're exposed to, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the scale of exposure is really staggering. I mean, more recently than that, after we published that 2015 paper, there was a report that came out of a Swiss research group where it was really interesting kind of bit of sort of citizen science approach. They put out a call for people who were going on holiday to bring them back a honey sample from wherever they were going in the world. And they analyzed them. They only looked for neonicotinoids, didn't look for any other pesticides. But 75% of samples from all over the world contain detectable levels of at least 1 and sometimes up to 5 different neonicotinoids in a single sample. And, you know, this included islands in the middle of the Pacific, you know, really remote corners of the world where you think, God, you know, even there, these poor bees are being, and given that these are neurotoxins that are really phenomenally toxic, and often the concentrations being found in honey were higher than concentrations that are known to have sometimes lethal, not let alone sublethal effects on bees. Then you know, we shouldn't really be surprised that insects have problems, really, because I mean, I guess the important point is here that if honeybees are being exposed, it means that all flower visiting insects are being exposed. So, and that's tens of thousands of species.
Yeah. So, Dave, we want to go ahead.
Digression.
Digress.
Just a quick honey digression. So my sons and I brewed our first batch of mead this last year, 6 or 8 months ago, and it's still aging in the bottle and needs, you know, I think a few more months to improve. But is this the kind of thing where you think there are health risks to people from eating lots of honey?
That's a difficult one. I mean, people think of honey as a really healthy food, don't they? And,
totally.
You know, it has antibacterial properties and all sorts of, you know, people pay a fortune for Manuka honey. I mean, I guess if you're optimistic, the concentrations of any one chemical in honey should be well below the harmful levels in humans. You know, I mean, neonicotinoids are pound for pound about 1,000 times more toxic to a bee than they are to a human. So you would need to ingest quite a bit relative to what a bee would need to do you any harm.
You have to be a poo bear, basically, to do it.
But coming back to the cocktail effect, that we don't really understand. You know, whether you know, because that honey's got 10 different pesticides in it, and then probably everything else you eat has also got different pesticides in it, then the combined effect of all that on you, I wouldn't like to say. You know, I don't think anybody could tell you whether that's doing you any harm or not.
Okay.
Let's stick with this diet thing real quick, Dave. There's a line, there's actually a couple of lines in your Science Express paper that I got to chuckle at as I was reading. But one of them, just to follow off of this diet thing, you wrote that if a human were to consume nothing but sardines 1 month, chocolate the next, turnips the month after, and so on, one could reasonably expect him to fall ill. And you were using that to emphasize, you know, what are the implications of honeybees foraging constantly on sunflowers or canola or whatever? Do we know? I mean, is this something you sort of speculated we should go research because it's reasonable to expect problems, or do we know that monocultural foraging is unhealthy for the bees?
We know a little bit about this. So people have done experiments controlling the diet, of the pollen diet that they give to developing bees. And I mean, pollens are very variable in how nutritious they are. And there is clear evidence that a mixed pollen diet is better for a bee than a monofloral pollen diet. So it is, I mean, there's no doubt at all, it is bad for bees to you know, spend a month eating nothing but almond pollen, and then, you know, wherever they go to next in the great bee tour of the United States that they do every year.
Wow. It's just opened up a new way of thinking about the implications of all of that food, in the same way that the obesity epidemic that it's created, the sort of health implications for wildlife too.
There's an interesting angle on this. There's someone at Sussex, a postdoc called Beth Nichols, who's studying whether adult bees actively try to choose a nutritious blend of pollens to feed to their offspring. She's looking particularly at solitary bees, where, because they provision one cell at a time, you know, if they're just visiting one flower, then that larvae is just going to get one type of pollen. So does the mother deliberately collect from multiple flower species and pack a mixed load into each cell. It's early days. She's only just started looking into it, but
and the idea would be to get just a greater range of nutrition and presumably higher levels of protein, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, protein's the kind of the main nutrient they get from pollen, but there are also a whole bunch of trace elements and vitamins and so on, and oils and all sorts of other interesting compounds that are really important, and that help to, which is why having a mixed supply of pollen is better for the larvae, we think. But whether the bees can actually tell what's in pollen while they're collecting it, and because bees visit hundreds of different species typically, or are capable of visiting hundreds of different species of plant. But so when bees are collecting nectar, it's just a sugar source, and a bee can tell straight away how sweet nectar is. But when she's collecting pollen and putting it on her legs, or however, depending on the species carrying, she's got no easy way of telling how much protein is in there, what lipids are in there, and so on. So it's kind of an interesting area of research that I'd never thought about until Beth came along. That do they assess the quality of pollens and make strategic decisions based on pollen quality as to which ones they're going to collect today and feed to their offspring?
Well, that sounds super interesting. I'll be looking forward to those papers. We haven't talked too much yet about the consequences of declines in bees for the rest of the world, and maybe let's just turn now to that for a few minutes, and start with what we might term the pollination crisis, right? So obviously bees are important for pollinating lots of crops in the world. They're also super important for pollinating lots of wild plants. So what are the effects of these observed declines on pollination services?
So there's clear evidence that some crops, some of the time, are having their yields reduced because there aren't enough pollinators. There are a few. Well, one really famous example, which is often cited, of in southwest China, where they now commonly hand pollinate apples and pears. There are huge areas of apple and pear orchards there.
You said they're hand pollinating because there's not enough pollinators.
There's not enough pollinators, not enough wild pollinators to do the job. And I've seen it in India as well, where in northeastern India near Calcutta, where the farmers are now hand pollinating squash plants because they're just not getting pollinated unless they do it themselves. And there's been some big scale studies looking at crop yields around the world and comparing insect and wind pollinated crops and how yields have changed over time. And there's pretty good evidence that we are on the edge of a crisis where yields are going to be depressed more and more because there aren't enough pollinators to go around. So clearly that's a worry, because roughly 3/4 of all the crops that people grow need pollination to varying degrees. Some can produce quite a lot of yield without any pollination. Some produce nothing. So there's a whole spectrum there. And although it's 3/4 of the crops by species, those crops only produce about 1/3 of our food by weight, because the wind pollinated grasses make up the bulk of our
wheats
diet.
and corns and
and if you then take into account the fact that some of those insect pollinated crops will actually produce a reasonable yield without pollination, actually it's something like 8 to 10% of our food globally is dependent on pollinators, but that's still quite a lot of food. And it's the healthiest chunk of our diet. So right now, globally, if you look at diets and human nutrition in relation to what we grow way more cereal and oil than we need to feed everybody. But we don't grow enough fruit and veg to give everyone a healthy diet. So even if it was completely fairly distributed, there aren't enough fruits and veg for everybody. So if you were to take away
junk food on a global scale here.
I mean, that's why, our diets are dominated by processed starchy foods, pasta and bread cake and biscuits and pies and pastries and so on. It's all because it's all comes from cereals basically, and we've got loads of those.
Yeah.
But we don't have enough of apples and tomatoes and so on, which are the things that need the insects.
So in terms of pollination by honeybees versus wild bees, you guys and others have evidence that wild insects and wild bees in particular are particularly important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it varies crop by crop, and it's hard to generalize. But there is this kind of common misconception out there that the honeybee pollinates all of our crops, and we don't need any other pollinators at all, which is absolute rubbish. So in the UK, there was an analysis done of this, and it concluded that honeybees contribute a maximum of 30% of crop pollination.
That's amazing. My intuition was it was way higher than that.
It may be different in the US. I've not seen any attempt to do that.
No, this is an intuition. I have no data. I mean,
yeah. Well, I think I would have guessed it was higher than that too, but that's what the numbers seem to show. So, the bulk is being done by these wild insects that nobody looks after at all, that we just assume are going to turn up. And obviously the worrying thing is that they're not anymore.
Yeah.
Let's try to put a positive perspective on some of this. There are some things we've already talked about having gardens if you're living in the cities. I mean, they're positive, potentially positive impacts. But if you're an individual landowner, I mean, what are the kinds of behaviors that are most promising to have the positive impacts we look for?
Well, so just to go back to the gardening thing, I mean, actually, although we've talked about it briefly, and gardens on average are not bad for bees and other insects. I think there's a huge potential there for them to be much better, and for us to do a lot in urban areas to make them into, as biodiverse as possible, because there's not really much of a compromise to be made there. There's not a big downside to making our gardens and our city parks and so on more insect friendly. We're not sacrificing food production or anything like that. The only compromise really is we have to persuade people to maybe accept things looking a bit different, instead of mown grass, tall flowers, that kind of thing. But, given that the number of people is set to continue, probably the extent of urbanization is going to expand globally. It seems like a kind of an easy win option to try and promote conservation of insect life and biodiversity generally in urban areas. And it's something that people are kind of buying into. There's already people, planting their gardens full of bee-friendly flowers, butterfly-friendly flowers. Garden centers market plants with bee logos as one, pollinator-friendly plants and so on. So there's a whole industry there springing up. And I think it's a bit of an open door that, it's one of my kind of, passions, I guess, is trying to promote that as one way we can help to combat insect declines. And it's a nice one because it's something everyone can get involved in, or at least everyone that's lucky enough to have a bit of a garden. And it's unlike many of these big kind of doom and gloom environmental stories, climate change or the rainforests on fire in Brazil or whatever, at least with insect declines, people can actually they can plant a lavender in their garden or whatever it might be, and they can see it, literally within 5 minutes, you'll see bees sniff it out and start feeding. So, people can feel they're doing something useful. And also it's a kind of way of maybe getting people to reconnect a bit with nature, inviting nature into our cities. So I think that's really cool. But the bigger issue is, what do we do about the rest of the world, the bits that aren't gardens, when that's a thornier issue. So we talked a bit about, that there are agri-environment schemes that are available to help farmers make their farms more insect friendly, but thus far they're not been hugely successful.
It just seems like given the fraction of pollination that's done by wild insects, that everybody's interests ought to be aligned in some way for promoting insect diversity, right? I mean, the farmers have a vested interest in doing that, so let's do that.
I think they have, and there was a really interesting paper published, I think it was 5 years ago, by Richard Pywell and folk from a UK government lab, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, but they did a big farm scale experiment where they got farmers to take out, it was either 3% or 8% of their cropped area and set it aside for biodiversity. Most of it went into flower strips. And they looked at the economics of the farm and the crop yield they got and so on. And the farmers who took 8% of their crop land out of production, in the first year or two, they got a slight reduction in yield, of course, because they were farming less land. But after 5 years, the yield was exactly the same. It had gone back up to the same as it was in the farms that hadn't taken any land out of production. And I thought, oh, that was really interesting. They put it down to a combination of better pollination and better pest control from natural enemies coming out of these nature areas. But
so with 8% less land, then you're producing just as much crop.
Yeah, I mean, so it's also worth kind of noting that they obviously they let the farmers choose which bits to take out, and the farmers inevitably chose the least productive bits, which is obvious. So they weren't losing 8% to start with in terms of crop yield. They
got it.
Considerably less. You know, there was the crappy sort of corners with poor soil and so on. But I thought that was really, I mean, you know, the take-home message from that ought to be that every farmer can take 8% of his land out of production and plant it full of flowers, and he won't lose any money at all. And I mean, you know, whether you can safely extrapolate, I don't know. But anyway, that it would be nice to think you could. And certainly it seems an avenue we should investigate more.
Absolutely.
But you know, that sort of just languishes in proceedings of the Royal Society. No farmers paid any attention to it. No government policymaker seems to have noticed. You know, but yeah, I think it would be possible to farm in a much more you know, it's a cheesy thing to say, but you need to kind of work with nature rather than, you know, keep trying to kill everything and control everything. And that sounds unscientific, but I think the basic idea that you know, if you trying to grow a crop, it's like a vacuum. If you try and kill everything, you know, you try and eradicate all the pests, then it's not a sensible strategy long term, because you know, the pests will evolve resistance. You're wiping out all the natural enemies. You're wiping out the pollinators. It doesn't make sense, and yet that's where we are. It seems it's so we need a bit of a rethink.
Yeah, agreed. But
it's hard to do.
So,
can I jump in with a question here?
Yeah.
Speaking of the economic stuff, and sorry I was late, guys. For some reason I had it on my calendar at a different time. I guess I was wrong.
No worries. You're here.
Time zone differences.
But Dave, I want to just touch on the economic stuff. You mentioned that there's this famous example of the apple farmers in China that had to go and hand pollinate all of their apples. I don't know if this is true, but the twist to the end of that story that I had always heard when I had heard people tell it is that they ran out of pollinators. They had to do it by hand. It seems terrible, but then their crop yields were way higher because the human pollinators were way more efficient than the bees, because, you know, they'd go out in the rain and do all this stuff. I guess the question from that is, like, number one, is that true? And then number two, does that mean environmental services are overrated? Or what does that mean?
I honestly don't know. I've heard these stories, but there's nothing published beyond the original description of this pollination deficit and hand pollination. And of course, it's China, so it's not the easiest place to go and, you know, you can't just jump on a plane and go and do some research and find out what's happening. So I don't know is the honest truth, exactly what's happening. And of course, China it's an odd situation because China has very cheap labor, and that's a high value crop where hand pollination clearly is economically viable. But, you know, it's hard to imagine the farmer in North America hand pollinating a canola field or whatever. You know, it's not going to happen. So yeah, but I agree that there are some question marks over exactly what's going on over in China.
Okay, I just want to follow up on that because I had heard the coda to that story, and I wasn't sure like what to make of it. But I think that's a good answer.
Well, Dave, hey, we've been talking now for about an hour and 15 minutes, and I want to start moving toward wrapping it up. We have a couple of sort of big forward-looking questions here at the end we'd like to talk over with you. And one of them is just to maybe ask you to lay out your vision for what we need to do going forward to actually monitor, in the UK, the US, around the world, and actually establish with more certainty what's happening with different species and different groups of insects. And so I guess this is imagine you have millions of dollars to spend on designing a study to do this. What would you do?
Yeah, I mean, it's really challenging, and so I'm really conflicted as to the best way to monitor insects. There was a paper published a few years ago which suggested that, for example, pan trapping is probably one of the better ways you might do it. Obviously, it doesn't capture all insects, but it's good for at least flower visiting insects. And it's very easy to do in a standardized way. And it's something that almost anyone can put out pan traps and collect them in again. And as long as you've got the resources to pay for a team of people to identify the contents of the pan trap, then that's actually a fair, relatively speaking, a cheap and effective standardized trapping system, monitoring system that could be rolled out on quite a big scale. We actually tried setting up our own citizen science-based pan trapping scheme in the UK a couple of years ago. There are some logistical problems, not least of which is you're not allowed to post bottles of alcohol through the post in the UK. So,
fundamental problem for science.
Limiting.
Yeah, and so we ended up asking people to pickle the insects in vinegar because that you can put that in the post, but it didn't work as well as alcohol, and we ended up with these rather disintegrated insect samples. I think that has potential, and it offers lots of advantages compared to anything else I can really think of. Although it obviously doesn't encompass, ground beetles or many other insect groups. Yeah. But I'm also a bit worried about lethal trapping. I didn't used to be. I mean, an entomologist for a long time. I've been very gung ho about, for example, the German study, which the Krefeld study, which showed this
Hallman et al. Paper.
Yeah, 76% decline over 26 years in German nature reserves. That was based on malaise trapping. Mm-hmm. And that study collected 50 kilos of insects. I have no idea.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the monitoring actually has negligible impact.
Right.
On the scale of Germany, 50 kilos of insects is probably nothing. But I think I'm getting soft in my old age, but I really...
You're tired of killing insects, huh?
Well, yeah, I think that's basically it. And I also think it kind of sends out the wrong message. If we want people to engage with insect conservation, do we really want to tell them to stick pan traps and drown a whole bunch of bumblebees and other pollinators in the garden? I'm not sure the knowledge we would gain is actually worth the that kind of effect it might have on, I don't know, just the whole thing.
Yeah.
The dissonance of killing for conservation is a little bit hard to reconcile.
Yeah.
It's like, museums used to go out and kill birds to get them into the trays, right?
Yeah.
We don't do that anymore.
Yeah. Well, exactly. We've all had to change, and the world is changing. And I think if we want people to respect nature more than they currently do, and to, kind of really live more, tread more gently on the planet, then promoting mass trapping of insect schemes is maybe not the way forward.
Yeah.
So if we get back to the sort of grand vision for monitoring, what would you do in the tropics, right? So we know a lot about Europe and the US. How do we figure out what's going on in the tropics?
With enormous difficulty. Honestly, I don't have a grand vision as to how you could do that. I mean, it's the logistics of it are so intractable. Sure, you could pick a few groups, the things that do work, if you could recruit local volunteers or pay for it to be done, you can walk a transect and count butterflies. Even in the tropics, that would be challenging, because obviously there are many more species, but it could be done. I think it's just about viable. So you could choose a few groups and focus on those and try to use them as an indicator species. it would be a long, long way from ideal.
Yeah.
But it would be a start. It would be better than the no data at all situation
Right.
we're in at the moment. I mean,
Right.
and obviously the sooner we started, the better, because it's like planting a tree. The best time to do it was 20 years ago, but failing that, do it today. But it's so difficult to get anyone to fund long-term monitoring because it's a no interest for the first decade. It doesn't tell you anything. So I mean, our whole funding model isn't built around long-term research, sadly.
Yeah.
Certainly in the UK, you can never get grants for more than 3 years. So
yeah, so a shout out to our listeners. If any of you have the resources to do this, contact Dave.
Dave, what about Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I won't hold my breath for the phone to ring.
It doesn't hurt. What about technological innovations? How much is environmental DNA? Are those approaches being used to try to at least find out who is where? Getting the numbers is, of course, more difficult, but is that something that's becoming common?
It's certainly, as I understand it, and it's not, really my area of expertise, but it seems to have huge potential. But my understanding is you really need to, you need to have genotyped every species that might be in your sample first before you can then search for them.
Yeah. Sure.
And obviously for most insects, and particularly in tropical regions, nobody's taken a DNA sample. So until that is done, and when there are millions of them to do, that's obviously quite a challenge. It's been applied in looking at pollinator behavior and where they're collecting their food by identifying the sources of pollen that bees are collecting. And that's really nice as a way of looking at quantifying pollination networks. And it seems to be, quite quick and effective. So in theory, in the future, I guess, as these things become cheaper and faster, it could be pretty powerful.
But so as I understand it, nobody is going out and looking and collecting flowers and then scraping bee DNA off of those and identifying what's
other way around.
No, okay.
No, I don't. I doubt. Oh, who knows? I mean, I find some of this environmental DNA stuff, it blows my mind. That,
I know.
The idea that you can take a little water sample from a pond and detect whether there's a newt somewhere in that pond,
Yeah.
Really, is there so much newt DNA just sloshing around? But yeah, theoretically, I guess that kind of approach might work wonders in the future if there's anything left to monitor by the time we get that far.
Right. So Dave, we really appreciate the conversation. I wish the topic was a little bit more exciting. Not that it's not exciting, but to be depressed is never where we want to leave the audience. So here's your opportunity to inspire us in any way you want. The last question we ask our guests is, what did we not give you the chance to say regarding conservation, regarding your own research, ways forward, anything you'd like to say?
I'd like to say two things, if that's all right. Just like I started off with two things. So one of them I've already said, but I'm going to say it again because I think it's really important that people can get involved. They plant a flower, stop using pesticides in your garden, make a compost heap, dig a pond. There's reams of information out there about how people can make their own little patch insect friendly, and it's really rewarding and fun. And if everybody did it, it would help. But big picture, I'm quite inclined to think we need to try somehow to completely change the way we grow food and free up huge amounts of land for rewilding projects. The E.O. Wilson half-earth approach. Actually, we have this food production system at the moment, which is completely bonkers. It does enormous environmental damage. It contributes massively to climate change, soil erosion, biodiversity collapse. And we throw away a third of the produce that we grow in the world. We feed way too much to animals. We eat too much meat. The whole system's crazily inefficient. And if you actually could somehow coordinate a redesign of our food production system, you could feed the world easily with a small proportion of the existing farmland and turn over vast tracts to nature. And that's what I'd really, really love to see. Of course, it's pie in the sky, but theoretically it's possible. And if we're really going to, save the planet so that future generations get to appreciate this amazing biodiversity that we have, then we have to think big. And I'd love to see us somehow finding a way down that route.
Good.
I'm inspired.
Yeah, that was inspiring. That was good. That was a great way to end. It is possible. It's difficult, but it is possible.